Look at that. Someone's grandma get lost on the way to the bingo hall? The voice was young, laced with the kind of casual arrogance that only comes from being at the absolute top of your game and knowing it. Kade Jennings, a Marine sniper barely 24 years old, nudged his spotter, Leo Martel, with his elbow. They were laid out prone on the firing line of a high desert range in Nevada, a place where heat shimmered off the packed earth in waves that could make a man see ghosts. The air was thin, the sun was a merciless hammer, and the wind was a fickle beast, whispering one moment and howling the next. It was a place designed to separate the good from the legendary, and Kade and Leo considered themselves well on their way to the latter. They were observing the figure who had just stepped out of a dusty, faded blue pickup truck that looked as old as she did. She moved with a slow, deliberate gait, her back a little stooped, but not from weakness. It was the posture of someone who had carried heavy things for a very long time. Her hair was a cloud of silver white tied back in a simple bun, and she wore practical canvas pants and a faded work shirt, the kind of clothes that had seen decades of sun and washing. She carried a long, heavy rifle case, not a modern Pelican case made of high-impact polymer, but an old leather and canvas one, worn smooth in places and darkened with age and oil. Leo squinted through his spotting scope, not at the distant targets, but at the old woman. No way, man. They wouldn't let a civilian on range 17, especially not on long-range qual day. He adjusted his focus. Check out the rifle case. That thing belongs in a museum, probably a Springfield or an old Winchester. Kade chuckled, the sound muffled by the dirt. Maybe she's here to show us how they did it in the Civil War. Think she brought her musket balls? Their world was one of carbon fiber stocks, advanced computational scopes, and proprietary ammunition engineered to cheat the wind. They were masters of a universe measured in milliradians, Coriolis effect, and spindrift. The woman was an anachronism, a sepia-toned photograph walking into their high-definition world. She didn't seem to notice their stares or their soft, mocking laughter. Her attention was on the range, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening not to the wind, but for the wind's secrets. Her eyes, narrowed against the glare, scanned the full length of the valley, from the firing line to the impossibly distant steel plates that shimmered like lost dimes in the heat. There was a stillness about her, a profound economy of motion that was at odds with her apparent age. She wasn't just looking, she was reading the landscape, a text only a very few people could comprehend. And the young men, wrapped in their certainty and their state-of-the-art gear, missed it completely. She made her way to the far end of the firing line, giving a wide berth to the small cluster of active-duty snipers and instructors. She chose an empty station, setting her ancient rifle case down with a soft thud. The sound was swallowed by the vast, empty silence of the desert. From a nearby observation tower, Sergeant Major Reyes watched her through a pair of high-powered binoculars. Reyes had been a rangemaster here for 15 years, and before that, a force recon sniper for 20. He had seen every kind of shooter imaginable, the brash prodigies, the quiet professionals, the washed-out failures. He didn't recognize the woman, and civilians were indeed a rarity, usually high-level defense contractors or visiting dignitaries. But she had been cleared by range control, her name on the roster simply listed as Vance E. Consultant. Reyes lowered his binoculars, a thoughtful frown creasing his leathery face. Something about her posture. It wasn't stooped with age. It was a perfect, practiced prone position, just performed vertically. The way she carried the weight of that heavy case wasn't the awkward heft of an elderly person. It was balanced, centered, the way you carry something that has been a part of your body for a lifetime. He watched as Kade and Leo openly gawked, their whispers carrying on the dry breeze. Reyes sighed. Pride was a dangerous thing on a sniper range. It could make you blind to things you desperately needed to see. Alara Vance unbuckled the leather straps on her rifle case. They were stiff, but her fingers moved with a practiced dexterity that belied the wrinkles on her knuckles. Inside, nestled in worn, oil-stained wool, was a rifle that made Kade and Leo exchange another smirk. It was a behemoth of blued steel and dark walnut, a custom-built bolt-action rifle based on a heavily modified Mauser action. The barrel was long and thick, a bull barrel from an era before fluting and carbon fiber wrapping were common. The wooden stock was scarred and dented, but the dark grain shone with the deep patina of countless applications of linseed oil. It was a tool, not a trophy, and it wore its history on its surface. She mounted an equally old-looking scope onto the receiver, its tube a simple, unadorned cylinder, compared to the complex turret-bristling monstrosities on the younger snipers' rifles. Then, from a canvas satchel, she produced a box of ammunition. She opened it and began lining the cartridges up on her shooting mat. Leo zoomed in with his scope. "Holy crap, Kade, get a load of those rounds. They're huge. Gotta be .338 Lapua, maybe bigger. And look at the bullets. They're not sleek VLD match bullets. They look heavy, old-fashioned." Kade peered through his own scope. 250 grain, maybe even 300. Who uses bullets that heavy anymore? All that drop. It's a nightmare to calculate. My 190 grain VLDs are way flatter, way faster. They were talking about ballistic coefficients, the science of how efficiently a bullet flies. Modern sniper doctrine favored lighter, faster, more streamlined bullets. Hers were the opposite, heavy, slow, and seemingly archaic. Sergeant Major Reyes felt a jolt, a zap of memory so strong it was almost physical. The rifle. It wasn't just any old Mauser action, it was a GA, Precision Gladius action, a legendary piece of custom gunsmithing from the late 80s, built to handle immense pressures. And the stock. He zoomed in on a small, barely visible inlay near the grip. It was a tiny, stylized carving of a ghost. A whisper of a name echoed in his mind, a name spoken only in hushed, reverent tones in certain corners of the Special Operations community. Baba Yaga, the witch. A ghost story, a myth about a female Soviet sniper during their war in Afghanistan, a legend who later defected and worked with a shadowy U.S. task force during the Cold War. They said she never missed. They said she could read the wind like it was a book written in her native tongue. They said she used a custom rifle that fired bullets so heavy they laughed at crosswinds that would send other projectiles tumbling. Reyes had always dismissed it as a campfire story, a bogeyman invented to scare new recruits. But looking at the woman on his range, at her rifle, at the calm, absolute focus in her movements, he felt a cold dread mixed with profound awe. He was watching a myth set up her shooting mat. He grabbed the radio. "Range control, this is Reyes. Can you confirm the full name for the consultant, Vance E.?" The radio crackled back a moment later. "Sergeant Major, that's affirmative. Roster shows Vance, Ilara. Security clearance is... Wow, it's above mine. Above the general's even." Reyes put the radio down, his hand trembling slightly. Ilara, that was the name from the stories. The target was a standard 40 by 40 inch steel plate. The challenge was its distance, 3,500 meters, over 2 miles away. At that range, the world itself became a variable. The spin of the Earth, the minute changes in air density, the shifting currents of wind that could be blowing in 3 different directions between the rifle and the target. It was less a science and more a dark art. Kade and Leo had been trying for that target all morning. Their advanced gear gave them all the data. Their ballistic computers told them to dial 28.2 mils of elevation and hold 2.1 mils for wind. They were both exceptional shots, and they had both missed, their bullets landing frustratingly close but never connecting. The wind was a demon, a swirling, unpredictable force that toyed with their high-tech, high-velocity rounds, pushing them just off course in the final, critical moments of their flight. "Mirage is boiling out there," Leo muttered, his eye pressed to his spotter. "I can barely get a clear picture of the plate. The wind at our 6 is pushing left, but the flag at 1,000 meters is limp. God knows what it's doing in the valley." Kade grunted in frustration, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's an impossible shot. The conditions are garbage. No one's hitting that today." He said it with the finality of an expert, a declaration that if he couldn't do it, it simply couldn't be done. It was then that they heard the quiet, methodical sound of a heavy rifle bolt being worked at the end of the line. Ilara Vance lay behind her rifle, a picture of absolute tranquility. She was not a part of the environment. She was the environment. Her breathing was slow and even, each exhale a tiny puff of dust from the mat. She wasn't using a ballistic computer. In her lap was a small, leather-bound notebook filled with handwritten notes, the pages yellowed and soft with age. She consulted it for a moment, then made a small adjustment to her scope's elevation turret. The clicks were loud and authoritative in the silence. She held a simple kestrel wind meter in the air for a moment, but she seemed to be paying more attention to the dance of dust devils 1,000 yards away, the sway of a single, stubborn weed on a distant ridge, the subtle changes in the texture of the heat mirage. These were the things her notebook couldn't tell her. Reyes watched, mesmerized. He knew what he was seeing. It was a masterclass. The young sniper saw an old woman with outdated gear. He saw a grandmaster reading the board, seeing moves no one else could even conceive of. She wasn't calculating the wind, she was communing with it. She felt its pulse, its rhythm. Her heavy, slow-moving bullet wouldn't be as susceptible to the sudden fickle shifts that were bedeviling the lighter rounds. It was a brute, designed to punch through the atmospheric noise with sheer momentum. It was a choice born not of theory, but of 1,000 brutal lessons learned in places far worse than this. She settled into the rifle, the wooden stock seeming to melt into her shoulder. Her cheek weld was perfect, her body a single solid unit of bone and muscle connected to the earth. There was no fidgeting, no last-second adjustment. She became utterly still. Her left eye closed, and her right eye, looking through the old glass, was as calm as a frozen lake. Her finger rested on the trigger. The world seemed to hold its breath. Even Kade and Leo stopped their murmuring, sensing a shift in the range's energy. Alara's breathing slowed until it was almost imperceptible. One slow exhale, letting half the air from her lungs. A pause in the natural respiratory cycle. And then, a sound that was both a crack and a boom, a deep-throated roar from the old rifle that seemed to shake the very ground. The recoil pushed her back, but her body absorbed it perfectly, her eye never leaving the scope, already tracking the vapor trail of the massive bullet on its long journey. For Kade and Leo, the wait for their own shots to land, a flight time of around 4 seconds, felt like an eternity. Alara's bullet would be in the air for nearly 8 seconds for the wind to work its mischief, 8 seconds for gravity to pull it down over 300 feet, 8 seconds of pure, agonizing suspense. The silence stretched, 4 seconds, 5, 6. Kade was already shaking his head, a smirk returning to his face, 7, and then a sound. Faint, tinny, carried back across the 2 miles of desert on the wind. Ping, Kade's jaw dropped. Leo ripped his eye away from his own scope as if it had burned him. No freaking way. He frantically swung his spotter back to the target. Through the boiling mirage, it was unmistakable. A dark, fresh smudge, dead center on the steel plate, a perfect first-round impact. He zoomed in, his hands shaking. The smudge was not just on the plate, it was a deep crater, a testament to the kinetic energy that heavy bullet had carried with it all the way from the firing line. The shot wasn't just a hit, it was an exclamation point, a statement of authority. On the observation tower, Sergeant Major Reyes slowly took off his cap and held it over his heart. He hadn't just witnessed a great shot, he had witnessed a miracle. He had seen a ghost story come to life and prove that the legends were all true. He keyed his radio, his voice thick with emotion. "Spotter on target 12, confirm impact." The voice that came back was young and full of disbelief. "Confirmed, Sergeant Major, dead center hit. I don't know how. We've been watching that target all day." Reyes looked down at the 2 young snipers on the line. They were sitting up now, their own multi-$1,000 rifles forgotten in the dirt. Their faces were a mixture of shock, confusion, and a dawning, terrible sense of humility. They looked like boys who had just seen magic for the first time. Reyes climbed down from the tower and walked over to them. He stood over their position, his shadow falling across their expensive gear. "You two have anything to say?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Kade looked up, his face pale. "Sergeant Major, we didn't see that coming." Leo just shook his head, speechless. "You know who that is?" Reyes asked, nodding towards the far end of the line where Alara was already calmly ejecting the spent cartridge. The boys shook their heads. "You were busy making jokes about bingo halls," Reyes said, his voice hard as iron. "You were mocking her equipment. You were so impressed with your own technology that you forgot what really matters." He crouched down, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "That woman is Alara Vance. In certain circles, they used to call her Baba Yaga. She was taking shots like that in the Hindu Kush Mountains with iron sights and Kentucky windage before your fathers were born. That rifle isn't a museum piece, it's a legend. And she is the reason half the ballistic science you rely on even exists. She wrote the book, then threw it away because she knew the wind doesn't read. The color drained completely from their faces. They had heard the stories, the impossible tales of a ghost sniper, and they had just laughed at her. The weight of their arrogance crashed down on them. It felt heavier than any rucksack, more suffocating than the desert heat. They looked at each other, a shared shame passing between them. Then, without a word, Kade stood up, brushed the dust from his uniform, and started walking towards her. Leo was right behind him. They stopped a respectful distance from her mat. She was cleaning her rifle bolt with a small oil-soaked rag, her movements precise and unhurried. She didn't look up. "Ma'am," Kade began, his voice cracking slightly, "I'm Corporal Jennings. This is Corporal Martell." She paused her work and finally looked at them. Her eyes were pale blue, and they held no anger, only a deep, weary wisdom. "We wanted to apologize, ma'am," Leo added, his voice barely a whisper, "for our disrespect. We were out of line." Alara looked from one young face to the other. She saw the shame, but she also saw the genuine contrition behind it. She gave a small, slow nod. "Apology accepted, corporals." She turned back to her work. Kade hesitated, then found his courage. "Ma'am, that shot. We've been trying all day. The wind. How did you—" He trailed off, not knowing how to ask. She finished wiping the bolt and slid it back into the rifle's action with a slick, satisfying snick. "You were watching your computers," she said, her voice soft but clear. "They tell you what the wind was doing. They don't tell you what it's about to do." She picked up one of the heavy cartridges, holding it between her thumb and forefinger. "You laughed at my bullets," she stated, not as an accusation, but as a fact. "You called them slow and heavy. You are correct. They are." She held it out for them to see. "Your bullets are like scalpels, fast, light, precise. They are excellent for surgery, but in a storm, a scalpel gets blown away. My bullet," she said, her gaze intense, "is a hammer. It is not as fast. It does not care about being elegant. It carries its own authority. At extreme range, the wind has more time to affect it, yes, but its mass, its momentum, gives it stability. It resists the little whispers and gusts that push your scalpels off course. It hears only the main voice of the wind, not the gossip." She looked them both in the eye. "You have to learn to listen for that voice. It's in the grass. It's in the heat rising from the rocks. It's in the silence between the gusts. Your computer can't hear it. Only you can." She laid the bullet back on her mat and began to pack her gear. The lesson was over. Kade and Leo stood there, the simple, profound truth of her words settling over them. They had spent years mastering the science of their craft, only to be reminded that it was, and always would be, an art. They had been humbled not by a piece of technology, but by a wisdom so deep it felt elemental. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the desert in hues of orange and purple, Alara Vance slung her heavy rifle case over her shoulder. She gave the two young men one last nod, a silent acknowledgement of a torch being passed, and walked back to her old blue truck. They watched her go, no longer seeing an old woman, but a giant, a living piece of the history they had only read about. They stayed on the firing line long after she was gone, staring out at the distant steel plate, listening for the first time not with their ears but with their souls for the true voice of the wind.